So we have one trachea, which is zero generation. The bronchi can further divide. We can have the first generation, second, and the third generation. The bronchioles can go on to fourth generation and fifth generation. These are divisions up to 16th generation. We can have the generation up to 23rd generation. So from the trachea to the terminal bronchioles, these are conducting zones. They conduct air. Okay. And then from the respiratory bronchioles to the alveolar duct and then alveolar sacs, these are called respiratory zone. Okay. These are called respiratory zone. We are going to talk more about this when we look at concept of dead space. Okay, called concept of dead space. Now, what about the respiratory unit? A respiratory unit is defined as the structural and functional unit of the lungs, okay, where there is actual exchange of gases between the lungs and blood. Exchange of gases only occurs in this part of the respiratory tract. Few alveoli are present in the walls of the alveolar duct. Thus, respiratory unit includes the respiratory bronchioles, it includes the alveolar ducts, the alveolar sacs, and the antrum, and the alveoli itself. So, these are respiratory unit. We have the respiratory bronchiole, we have the alveolar duct, okay, and then the alveoli. Alveoli is a singular, it's a plural for a single alveolus. Okay. And then we have also the antrum. Okay, in short, what we are saying, where does exchange of gases take place? It takes place in the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar sac. Okay, at least here you can see respiration taking place, exchange of gases. So any damage to these structures, like in cases of asthma or in cases of other pathological diseases such as fibrosis, it can affect exchange of gases. Okay, we'll talk about those later on. Okay. So, what about the respiratory membrane? The respiratory membrane is a membranous structure through which the exchange of gases occurs. So, respiratory membrane separates air in the alveoli from blood in the capillary. It is formed by the alveolar membrane and the capillary membrane. Respiratory membrane has a surface area of 70 square meters. Okay, 70 square meters is 70 by 70. It's a very big space. That's why we have millions of alveoli in the lungs. It's just to increase the surface area of gaseous exchange. So that surface area is 70 square meters. Not centimeters, but meters. And the thickness, okay, it's about 0.5 micron. This can also be called 0.5 micrometers. That's how thick the barrier. So we are talking about the barrier through which air should cross. It's about 0.5 micrometers. So this diagram shows the same barrier. This is the air space within the alveolus. And then we have, within the alveolus, we have macrophage, which are very important in immunity. And then we have the type 2 pneumocytes, which secrete surfactants. So these are the surfactants which I said they secrete a kind of a lipid that prevents the lungs from collapsing. The purpose of the surfactants is to reduce surface tension. We'll talk about that. And then we have the type 1 pneumocytes. The functions of these is not very well known, but it has been known that the type 1 pneumocytes can generate or differentiate into the type 2 pneumocytes. So this is the alveolar epithelium, and then we have the capillary endothelium, and then the red blood cell. So what are the barriers? When air is in this place, the alveolus, it has to cross into the capillaries. So it passes through the barriers. The first barrier is it's the alveolar fluid with surfactants. Then it passes through this barrier called the alveolar epithelium. Okay, the epithelium. You remember epithelial cells from histology. So this is called the alveolar epithelium. And we know the epithelium, they have the basement membrane of the alveolar epithelium. It has to pass through this basement membrane, which is made up of collagen type 4 proteins, and then it has to pass through the interstitial space. Okay, interstitial space is neither in the blood vessels, it's just the space outside blood vessels. It's called the interstitial space. And then from the interstitial space, air has to cross the basement membrane of the capillary endothelium. Okay, and then it also has to pass through the capillary endothelium. Okay, the cells lining the blood vessels are called capillary endothelium. From there, now air can enter into blood, and then it diffuses into this protein called hemoglobin. Okay, so this is a respiratory membrane. So just apart from exchange of gases, the respiratory system is involved in these following functions: olfaction, vocalization, prevention of dust particles, defense mechanism, maintenance of water balance, regulation of body temperature, regulation of acid-base balance, anticoagulant function, secreting angiotensin converting enzyme, very important in regulation of blood pressure, and synthesis of hormonal substance. Okay, so these are non-respiratory function of the respiratory system. These will be discussed in other topics, but it's just important to know that apart from exchange of gases, the respiratory system is involved in these other functions. There's also this concept called the respiratory protective reflex. These are some of the few reflexes that try to protect the respiratory system. We have the cough reflex, the sneezing reflex, and the swallowing reflex, and many other reflexes. Okay, you know what a cough is, isn't it? Like when I do, that is a cough. It protects the respiratory system. So what's the mechanism of a cough? The mechanism of a cough, how does a cough take place? Since a cough is a reflex, so it follows the same reflex arc like any other reflex you can mention. Blood pressure regulation reflex, patellar tendon reflexes, swallowing reflex, defecation reflex. It follows the same mechanism. The first component, there should be a receptor. For any reflex, there should be a receptor, because we know a reflex is something that occurs so quickly without our conscious being aware. Okay, it happens so quickly. So it's important to know that the reflex follows a particular arc. It starts with a receptor. The receptor, then it moves through the afferent fibers to the centers. The center can be the spinal cord or the brain. Then from the center, it is carried back through the efferent fibers. The efferent fibers to effector organs. Effector organs can be glands or muscles. Okay, can be glands or muscles. So the cough begins with deep inspiration, followed by a forced expiration with a closed glottis. This increases the intrapleural pressure above 100 millimeters of mercury. You remember what the intrapleural pressure is, eh? So this increases the intrapleural pressure above 100 millimeters of mercury. Then the glottis opens suddenly with explosive outflow of air at high velocity, and the velocity of the airflow may reach to about 960 kilometers per hour. It causes expulsion of irritant substance out of the respiratory tract. That's what we want. So what is a cough? A cough is expiration against a closed glottis. Okay, it is an expiration against a closed. The whole purpose is to increase the pressure in the thoracic, in the lungs. That's why we are saying against the closed glottis. The pressure increases within the lungs, but it's not being expelled. Okay, the moment the glottis opens up, the pressure comes out, or air is forced with a high velocity of about 960 kilometers per hour. And this can cause expulsion of irritant substances out of the respiratory tract. Okay, so let's follow through this diagram. We have the irritants. Irritants can either be a chemical stimulation or mechanical stimulation. Any irritation within the respiratory tract can be a stimulus for a cough. It can either be part of the upper respiratory tract or the lower respiratory tract. Okay, even congestive heart failure can also elicit this cough reflex. We'll look at those later on. So an irritant will be sensed by the receptors. Remember, the receptors are biological transducers. So the receptors within this region will convert the chemical property of the irritant into an electrical impulse. This is called an action potential. Okay, it's called an action potential. So this action potential will be rapidly propagated through the trigeminal nerve. This is cranial nerve number 5, towards the central nervous system. In this case, we have the brain stem, which is part of the brain. So impulse reaches the brain stem, specifically the sensory nucleus, and we also have the nucleus ambiguous. Okay, there are a lot of things happening here. It's a complex structure, but the whole purpose of this structure is to process the information. That's why we say the nervous system is important in regulation of physiological processes. So it has to first move to the spinal, to the brain for processing and interpretation. So once the information has been processed, it is sent back through the cranial nerve number 9. This is 10. This is 11. Okay. So some of these innervation, it innervates the glottis, so the glottis closes up. Some of the nerve fibers innervates the diaphragm, like the phrenic nerve. Other nerve fibers, like the vagus nerve, innervates the lungs. Okay, and the abdominal muscles, as you can see. So they'll bring the information back in form of an action potential. So the whole purpose here is we are going to see a buildup of pressure within the lungs. All the muscles, they'll contribute to the buildup of pressure in the lungs. Okay, but that pressure air won't be the buildup of pressure will be more than the pressure in the atmosphere. Okay, but that air will not be expelled because the glottis is closed, but it will reach a particular pressure that will open up the glottis, pushing air out of the respiratory system. So this is just the cough reflex. We'll be referring to these later on. There are also other sneeze reflex, yawning reflexes. Okay, we'll still come back to this. So this is where I end. Thank you very much. This is just part 1. Look out for part 2.